and welcome to another edition of SNJ In Conversation with me, Tanya Tiraoro. And today I'm delighted to have with me two SEND education experts, Anne Heavey, who's the director of Whole School SEND. Hello, Anne.
Hi, Tanya.
And Anne began as a music teacher, and she worked at a high level within government advisory groups. And Hannah Moloney. Hello, Hannah.
Hi.
Hi, and Hannah is a practicing SENCO and a dyslexia specialist. She's also a SEND researcher, and she's produced several national SEND reports that we've also run on Special Needs Jungle. Now, Anne and Hannah, as I said, will be familiar to regular SNJ readers because they've both written for us, very popular articles as well. And they're leading figures in the efforts to improve SEND training in schools. And we're here today to talk about the training materials provided by Whole School SEND, and particularly those aimed at SEND leaders. I've been really happy to be part of the SEND expert reference group inputting into developing a guide for SEND leaders that was written by Helen and by Anne, and it's available now on the SEND Gateway. So welcome both. Let's kick off with a tough one. Why is SEND such a mess, and how much of it can be laid at the door of training? Because recent reviews of teacher training still show that there isn't enough SEND specific training unless you're on that kind of pathway. And it seems very variable according to recent reviews of it. So Anne, can I ask you first?
Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight that we've known for a long time, actually, that training plays a major part in some of the issues and concerns we've got around the performance of the system for young people identified with SEND. Andrew Carter reviewed initial teacher training in 2015, and I think you've just been quoting from his report. He highlighted there wasn't enough content and it was far too variable. And in 2017, newly qualified teachers reported that supporting pupils in the classroom with SEND was an area of really low confidence. So I think 3 years later, 5 years later, yes, we know that's an issue. And I think actually I'm really glad that we're talking about training and teacher preparedness, because whilst there are really important concerns around funding and accountability as well, so much of it comes down to attitude, confidence, and understanding that good teaching for all pupils and good teaching for SEND are very similar things, if not the same thing, the vast majority of the time. And certainly our priority at Whole School SEND is really to make sure that every teacher is equipped to deliver the very highest quality teaching possible to every pupil before we start putting in any additional interventions, and that we're really confident that the teaching is inclusive and that we really understand how children are learning, that our teaching is working. But I think there are some structural issues beyond training as well around accountability and the role of leadership within ensuring that those teachers are equipped. You know, like I said, 3 years later after those reports, why haven't we fixed it? Why haven't we sorted it out? And I think we have to talk about leadership within this context rather than just blaming individual teachers who are, you know, they're part of that wider organisation. And the accountability levers, which I think play into the priorities that maybe get the training and how that training is perceived. So training is a huge issue, but there are other interdependencies with things like leadership and accountability as well, which is why I think we're going to talk about some of these resources today.
Hannah, what's your take?
Well, I guess mine comes from the research that I've done. So when I first became a teacher, I was part of a cohort that was able to do their Masters in Education as part of that PGCE, and I came across the question about, you know, what is the difference between VAK, which is visual, auditory and kinesthetic learning, and multiple intelligences. And from that, I really actually opened a bit of a Pandora's box for myself in terms of, well, what do we even mean by intelligence? So for me, I think the issue around SEND and confidence with teaching and structures of support within education actually is systemic from the very origins of the creation of the schooling system. You know, back in 1870, when it was first made law that children should go to school. And when we look back at 1870 and what was going on then, it's the 19th century. It was a time of crossbreeding of animals to try and make the best animal, the concept transitioning over to humans and becoming the superhuman. That's going alongside the development of IQ testing and the development of ideologies around eugenics. And that also heavily links in with race and intellectual abilities from different countries and different people types. And if you watch that and how that develops over the 20th century, and of course we've got World War II, the Holocaust, and we've got civil rights in America and you know, the issues in South Africa, and you look about how the concept of some peoples being better than others, and how that transitions and goes through the education system, we aren't actually a million miles further forward than that. So partly I think we've got issues because our education system is actually, it does not represent what we know to be true of human intellectual capabilities in terms of the research and the science. The system is outdated. But also we have another issue in that the teachers that are part of this system were either themselves part of the secondary modern grammar you know, of the 1950s onwards, or we are children of people who went through that system. And so the beliefs and mindsets around some are better than others, some have different skill sets than others, and they have more or less value, is really well deeply embedded in our psyche. And so when we look at teachers in classrooms, they've either been part of that system and haven't questioned it, or they have been part of that system, they understand that is something that affects this mindset affects the education system, but they aren't yet able to know what to do because, quite frankly, the education sector hasn't caught up with the progression of other sectors like medicine. So when we look at the medical advancements over the 20th century and the scientific approach to research and measurement of impact, and the millions and millions and millions of pounds that have been pumped into that system to do that proper research and to see what works and what makes a difference, and to identify correctly and carefully what each individual might be experiencing and then finding a solution to that, we simply don't see that happening in the education system in the same way that has happened in other sectors. And then when you look at things like how much autism is costing the UK economy, autism alone, how much it costs is almost double, I think, the cost of cancer and the cost on the economy. So actually we are misplacing our finances, and where we haven't got the evidence to heavily invest because we haven't done that intense research and this is what makes a difference, we have to a certain extent, but not to the same levels of other sectors. We don't have then the evidence to invest. We don't know what makes a difference and what's worth putting money into. So I think we're still at quite early stages. We say, yes, training is a priority and it does need to happen, but we're still at a pretty basic stage of, well, what is it that we actually need to be doing and what is reasonable and possible within a classroom, and is a classroom even the right format for learning for pupils today? So mine's sort of a very big response to why are we in such a mess, but I think in some respects we've got some quite clear pathways of how to go forward, and in others I think we're still very behind where we need to be.
So what you're saying is it's not just institutional or systemic, it's actually, you know, generational, and somebody needs to have the authority to stand out of that side of that and say, look, it's the 21st century, it's time to do something different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from my perspective, the way forward, from me as a SENCO, from my individual perspective as a SENCO, but representing SENCOs across the UK, from my perspective, the step we need to get forward to quickly is a radical upskilling of the workforce to assess and identify SEND more quickly, and therefore have evidence as to what needs are there and then find solutions for those needs. Many of those we do know. That's not to suggest we don't have knowledge within the system, but until we have a crystal clear picture of what children are experiencing and how that is developing, and having, you know, really easy, simple, quick assessments that make a difference, then I think we're still going to be going around in the hamster wheel.
Yeah, I mean, I have personally never even thought about, because I haven't done the kind of research that you've done, and that's something that perhaps that we should look more deeply at on especially as young in the future. But one of those ways that we can improve this is by listening to those people who were inside the system, like parents, and as I said earlier, this is something that I've been involved with you ladies in on the group, and lots of these expert groups forget about the voice of the parent. They're not important. They are done too. They are part of the problem. But you don't feel that way. So, Anne, why was it important for you to include the parental voice?
It wasn't even an option to consider not including representatives from the family, because whilst our name is Whole School Send, which you'd think, oh, that just includes those that are in the school as staff, and certainly some of our funding is structured that way. The school is the community. The school is every person that interacts with it and draws on the community, and everyone plays a role in shaping the experience of school and the ethos and the enactment of what goes on. And anything that we put out that doesn't have the input of families and of children themselves will be incomplete, and will be missing perspectives, missing elements, and probably won't have the impact that we want to achieve. So from our point of view, it's a necessary element to achieving the strongest output we can. And I'm really proud of these guides that we've developed together with you. And I think had we not had that representation, they wouldn't have been as rich or as thoughtful. So it shouldn't be a case of forgetting the parent. I think even that sometimes is a bit of a polite way of saying I don't think they're forgotten. I think they're deliberately left out. I think a decision is sometimes made actually not to overcomplicate by forcing us to look at a more nuanced picture, and the family experience reminds us of the person and of the human underneath all of these decisions, in a way that if you only have professionals in the room, sometimes it's easy to forget those things. So yeah, it wasn't an option for us, and it's something we try and do in all of our projects, is make sure there's family representation and the child as well.
I mean, I think that would never before during the pandemic, we're seeing how important the parental input is when you're trying to educate children at home.
And with that, I think a really interesting thing we've been hearing through the experience of the last few months is where relationships were already strong with families and schools going into the pandemic, they've been strengthened, and it has been a team effort in making sure the child gets the best we possibly can out of this situation. Conversely, where those relationships maybe haven't been in place, it's actually been more difficult, because I think some of those schools have suddenly had to face up to shortcomings and not had the relationship in place to do that, and have maybe struggled to deliver what they should have done to that family because they hadn't kind of done the groundwork. So hopefully a big learning coming out of this is those relationships must be prioritised and are really valuable to invest in.
Yeah, I think particularly if you don't know the circumstances of the children in your class, when you're under lockdown, how do you know what they need to support them, particularly if they're shielding or if they don't have access to devices to do work? We've heard a lot of this in our survey, that, you know, children were expected to do work online when they didn't have access. So yeah, I think that's really important. But Hannah, these guides that we've produced, well, mainly you and Hannah, I have kind of stuck my 2 pence in. Why were they so badly needed? How did you discover that, you know, SEND leaders really didn't know, that school leaders really didn't know anything about SEND?
Well, I think lots of factors came together. So the root of all of the work that I've done sort of at a national level, it was born out of my own frustration in terms of not having enough time to do the SENCO role, and also experiencing the loss of time year on year. And at first I thought that was, to do with perhaps me not being able to do the job well enough. And of course, you internalize that. And then actually I realized, no, it really is not me. I am really struggling. This what I'm expected to do is impossible. And when I started to talk to my senior leaders around how I needed more time to be able to do that, I faced various barriers within school in terms of finance, awareness of the role. And what I really felt I needed was some kind of objective information that I could just bring out that said, look, this is actually what we need to be doing, rather than this being a battle of opinions or thoughts or ideologies. Actually, this is what we're supposed to be doing as a school. And I then joined Facebook groups, and to be honest, SENCO Facebook groups have been really, really fundamental in, I think, so many SENCOs' professional development and support and advice giving. And from that realization that this is actually not just an individual or a school-based level, this is actually a national systemic issue. From that, we were then able to put in place some research, and Nan and myself, along with Dr. Adam Bodison and Dr. Helen Curran, created the National SENCO Workload Surveys. From that, we have been able to ascertain some very clear pictures around the battles and structures that are inhibiting SENCO effectiveness. And from those the publication and the realization of what actually is going on at a national level, we were then able to target that strategically. So within the effective SENCO deployment booklet, I worked with a team of SENCOs and a parent to look at 5 strands which we felt were really preventing SENCOs from being as effective as they could be within schools. And then obviously, as part of our group, the expert reference group, we worked together on a guide that would help head teachers and senior leaders to effectively consider the strengths and areas for development within their school system of SEND provision. And I think the power around that is that when you think about who goes on to become a head teacher, very few, particularly at secondary level, have been a SENCO. So very few head teachers have had the depth and breadth of experience that SEND provision requires, and therefore they're leading without that detailed experience. And also, Anne, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the National Qualification for Headship still does not require a head teacher to do any SEND training as part of that qualification. So the guides themselves are actively targeting this deficit of training and experience that exists at head teacher level and governing body level. And it takes away, in my opinion, the potential area of conflict between SENCO and head teacher about what should or shouldn't be done, and makes it, it's sort of a strategic approach rather than people's differing opinions. And of course, head teachers have got huge stresses on them, balancing budgets and implementing policies and managing the coronavirus situation within their schools. These aren't simple challenges that head teachers are facing. And in fact, in one of our meetings up in London when we were creating this guide, I can remember one of the contributors saying that, when I was a head teacher, I barely had time to look at the asbestos regulations, which were regularly put on my desk, So there's so much that head teachers are going through and trying to unpick and implement. If they haven't got the experience and they don't have that guidance, then they're simply not able to do it in the way that you as parents, me as a SENCO, us as people who want to influence the national picture of SEND would want. So for me, it's about crucially taking away any kind of opinions and barriers and saying, this is what the government want you to do, and this is how you can reflect on that and develop that within your school.
So one of the barriers you just mentioned there is time. And how have they been received? And do you have any evidence that that SEND leaders, that school leaders are suddenly becoming more interested in SEND?
So annoyingly, our launch event was postponed and moved online due to COVID-19. Thanks, COVID, which was unfortunate because we hoped to make a bit more of a splash with them when we launched them. But they have had a warm response, and I can share with you just a couple of examples as to why I think they are being used and engaged with. So since May, the middle of May, we've been rolling out a webinar program as Whole School Send to respond to school priorities around SEND during the COVID-19 context. And we've had over 650 school leaders, senior leaders who are not SENCOs attend those webinars, and separate school leaders, which we were really encouraged and surprised by, actually. We were kind of heartened to see them kind of taking the time to come and engage with these materials, including a webinar that Hannah did for us very kindly on the SENCO deployment guide. And we've also sort of been, reaching out across our regional networks to speak to heads and sort of head teacher networks. And one of the things we're seeking to do with these materials, particularly the Demonstrating Inclusion Guide, is highlight the areas of business as usual within a school that by just reflecting on and tweaking can have a huge impact in the experience of inclusion across the whole school environment. And we've kind of made it a little bit easier to see, actually, this is part of my job. So reviewing the curriculum policy is part of my job. And if I just bear a few of these things in mind as I'm doing that, I'm going to end up with a better policy for more children. So we're not making it a separate job. We're not making it another thing that's on the desk of those busy head teachers. We're trying to kind of show how just adding a few thoughts, a few considerations to the everyday things that you're doing as a school leader, you can make a massive difference. And particularly around thinking around behaviour policy change and COVID-19, which is something I'm kind of thinking about a lot at the moment, and kind of that very understandable need to have clear expectations and routines to maintain safety, but making sure that we have reasonable adjustments and really understand what our individual pupils need to be safe and happy at school within that space. We've had feedback that the Demonstrating Inclusion Guide has really helped senior leadership teams to explore that element, and we curated a short version of our review suite for COVID-19, which is on the Gateway, which includes elements from Demonstrating Inclusion and the deployment guide to help kind of reflect on your preparedness from September. And those elements around culture and around well-being and the relationships within a school have been really well received by head teachers that just needed something to help them know where to start. So we'll continue to push them and push engagement, but the initial signs are good in the first few months.
And maybe actually the pandemic has given head teachers more time. You're cutting out the commute, you're cutting out interruptions, so you suddenly get more time to watch webinars. So, they cancelled the launch, but maybe, conversely, there was a positive aspect to it. But looking at training, the government's just published its response to the SEND inquiry, and one of the recommendations in the inquiry was so that the NASENCO award should be achieved within 6 months. Now, I think they've kind of got the wrong end of the stick there, because they seem to think that it had to be condensed into 6 months, where I think maybe the thinking was you had to start your training and then finish it within 6 months, which makes a lot more sense. So they've come out and said, no, we're not going to do that. But it seems to me unreasonable to be unqualified, essentially, in a SENCO role for 3 years. How can we change their mind and enable that they do understand the point of what was being suggested?
Do you want to start, Hannah, or shall I? Yeah, I think it's really important that we make sure that SENCOs are prepared in post when they start. And again, just thinking of the COVID-19 lens, I'm imagining what SENCO induction looks like this September for new and post SENCOs that haven't yet got the award, when we're dealing with such disruption, and a lot of the evidence bases that we'd be drawing on for identification have been really upended. I'm sure Hannah can speak on that further in a minute. I think so full declaration, whole school SEND have been kind of involved with the review of the qualification, and we have submitted some proposals to DFE around what we think should happen. But I think I won't be in any trouble for saying that we really need to make sure that qualification is taken in a timely fashion and really aligns with the practical roles that and decisions and the strategic leadership that SENCOs undertake from day one, whether or not they've got the qualification yet. And without my whole school SEND hat on, I'm very also interested in the journey to becoming a SENCO, and in how other qualifications like NPQs, national professional qualifications, help develop that understanding of leadership of SEND across the wider school leadership picture as well, and across the wider workforce, because I don't think we should only rely on the SENCO to be a leader of SEND. But I think watch this space and know that some of us are lobbying hard.
Hannah, what's your view on the NASENCO and the length of time it should be taken in before somebody starts?
Yeah, well, when I became a SENCO, I started my SENCO training at exactly the same time. And from my own personal experience and opinion, I think SENCO should do that. You shouldn't be enrolled without having started your NASENCO qualification. However, what I see in the SENCO forums, the rationale behind not doing the SENCO qualification from day one is often around the level of work required to do the qualification in addition to the normal day job. And this is where the barrier of time becomes so important, because if SENCOs, and we know that in the primary sector, in average sized primary school with average SEN, we know that SENCOs are having anything from no time at all to 5 days a week to do that role. So because of the inconsistency in terms of time allocations for SENCOs, some SENCOs will be able to do that qualification from the word go, because they will be supported with time, they will be supported with their senior leadership and having those days out, perhaps some study days at home. It is a meaty qualification, and rightly so, but it is demanding. Whereas there will be SENCOs in some schools who don't have any time to do the job, who don't have any time to do the qualification, and who aren't supported in the same way by their senior leaders. So from my perspective, I don't think, in my mind anyway, there should be any debate about when a SENCO should do it. They should do it from the word go. But I think the bigger issue is about how do we take away the barriers that are stopping SENCOs from taking it in the first place.
So the senior leader training and the SENCO training really do need to play in together, so that senior leaders understand the need to ensure that their SENCO is well trained. But so, for example, I'm a teacher, or I'm a trainee, and I'm keen to know more about SEND, and it's not on my course. So is reading a guide going to be enough? How can I get low-cost interactive training? I know you've just mentioned these webinars, which sound fantastic. And what is a gold standard training?
Well, the Department for Education has quite clear standards on the quality of CPD that should be in place, and a really important element that I think whatever you pursue should be built in is having an ongoing relationship with the people you train with and the people providing the training. So it's not a one-hit kind of half an hour on this and you're sorted, magic wand. It's actually you have time to reflect on and refine and review the content that you're exposed to and applying it in real time. From our point of view, we have a few things that might help with that. For example, we've got our videos that introduce some quite common areas of SEND, which provide a place to start. But I think I think if I were a new teacher and I was thinking I need to develop my skill set and my confidence here, that one of the cheapest and easiest things you could do is just have a conversation with the child's family that you're thinking you need to increase your skill set around. That'll probably be some of the best CPD you'll get for an immediate context. But within a school, you could set up a study group that looks at various things in the round and perhaps meets monthly to read and absorb something together, maybe have some input, maybe from one of our videos, maybe from somewhere else, and then reflect on how you can apply it in practice. So you're contextualizing it to your classroom and to your lesson. But I've always thought that the lowest cost training you can get is usually having a phone call or a cup of tea with a family and just understanding the child more fully. Hannah, what do you think?
Yeah, I really like that suggestion about talking to the family. I think, first of all, any teacher that is questioning how they can develop their inclusive teaching practice needs to be fully celebrated. Because I think, I don't have any evidence for this, but I feel that the teachers who don't take inclusion as seriously are perhaps ones who feel like when they try something it doesn't make a difference, or they tried it once and it didn't work. And I think that can then build in this sense of not feeling knowledgeable, or there isn't anything that really makes a difference, so why try? And I wouldn't say that there's only a small percentage of teachers that might feel like that, but I do think having the confidence and perhaps the braveness to say I need help is fundamental in the first step of actually developing a teaching practice. So I would say go, as Anne said, speak to the family, but also speak to the SENCO. They are incredibly busy, but they will make time for you, because I tell you what, I'm run off my feet all day every day, but anytime a teacher wants to talk to me about SEND, is playing into my favourite thing to talk about, so I'll happily do that. So speak to the SENCO. As Anne said, there's plenty of training. Go to NASEN, go to Whole School SEND. There's plenty of advice and guidance. There are parents out there who are taking matters into their own hand and training teachers through resources that they're creating. So there's a lady called Claire on Twitter who does ADHD support. And there's obviously lots of charities, Tourette's Action, autism charities. So in a way, there is so much to learn. Sometimes it can be difficult to actually find what it is you want to learn, because there's so much that you can sort of, you have to search through for it.
Well, that's what I mean about the gold standard, though. You know, how do you sort what is actually going to be useful from, just something that hasn't been well thought through or isn't backed by evidence.
And I think that really comes back to the point that I made at the beginning, is that we are still well behind the curve in terms of what works. So when you think about quality first teaching, this phrase that's used very regularly to describe what should be happening in classrooms, actually there is no definitive guide on what quality first teaching actually is. And even when within our own individual spheres as SENCOs, we might be talking about what quality first teaching looks like. So for example, I often saying to my teachers, put keywords on the board. It's so important to have keywords on the board. And that's one of my sort of benchmarks, if you like, is how I sort of assessing to see whether teachers are being inclusive in their practice. Even I don't know what difference keywords actually make in a very rigorous detailed study on the effect of keywords on the board. So actually I think we've got these lovely ideas of what quality first teaching might look like, but until we have absolutely crystal clear evidence to say when you put keywords on the board it makes X amount of difference to the children in that class. And whether that's possible to do, I don't know, but I still think we could get,
because every child is
measuring that. But when you put keywords on the board, it is likely to make this much difference towards an exam grade over time. Then teachers will start to say, okay, I will do it. It's worth me doing it. And, you know, when I walk around schools and I'm looking for things like keywords and I don't always see it, and I think about, well, it's not that hard to put keywords on the board, so why aren't teachers doing it consistently? For me, it's about just not developing good enough habits. It's about habits. It's not massively expensive to put a keyword on the board. It's not incredibly taxing in terms of planning to put a keyword on the board. You simply write a word on the board. But, you know, there's no cost to that, but there isn't the habit ingrained in people to do that. And I think that's where we need to get to in terms of quality first teaching. We need to explicitly develop those good habits and have evidence behind why we do those habits in the first place.
So there is a lot of training out there, as you said. Where is Whole School Send going next? How is it going to be involved in, you know, building learning for a pandemic hit nation, and how are you involving and still reaching parents? And you know, and what about this blended model? And so how is Whole School Send developing?
So we're continuing to kind of reach out across our regions. So we've just expanded our regional team to add a third person to each team, which is really exciting actually, because it gives us more capacity to support and to engage with local networks. So one of the key things that our regional leads do is identify local groups of parents, local charities, etc., that can help us spread that good practice back into schools. So we'll continue to, although our events are online now, we'll continue to make sure that we have parental representation at our events online, and also feeding into our resource production. So we're about to start construction of a classroom teacher's SEND handbook to help flesh out some of these issues around what is high quality teaching, and we've got parents and young people involved in drafting that to make sure it again captures the full experience, and a suite of ITT resources, initial teacher training resources, to kind of address what we talked about earlier with the variability in support that's available, which are all of that's going to be open access. So whether or not you have them built into your course, you'll be able to access them. And we'll have parents and as I said, children feeding into the construction as well as feeding back on the design of those. And we're also creating a suite of resources to support mainstream schools to be more inclusive for autistic people, including autistic family members and autistic staff, as well as children, because that's an area we're very concerned about, particularly secondary mainstreams, in that there's so much going on in the wider kind of larger environment of a mainstream secondary school that needs to be taken into account. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to encourage more thoughts around. It's not just inclusion for the youngster that's in front of you right now, it's inclusion for the whole community that you serve and engage with, and former students as well as potential students and their families. So we're working on that, and I think we're just really keen to kind of keep empowering any stakeholder that wants to improve things to draw on our resources. So if we have ideas on how we can support families better through our outputs, we'd love to hear them. Our favourite and most effective resource to date is a leaflet we created with children and parents around asking about SEN provision in school. And it's called Making Conversations Count, and it provides families with questions to ask a school around the provision that's in place for their child. And it was a very low cost output, but it has created an expectation in schools that families are really well equipped to ask probing questions and expect a decent answer. So I think we'll continue to create outputs like that help kind of raise the expectations in schools to be more transparent and have that two-way engagement with their families in a meaningful way.
It's been a really interesting discussion today, and it's really interesting to hear all the history around SEND, and we'd like to hear more about that. And I'd like to see you both back writing for us in the autumn as well. So thank you both again for joining us, and if there's anyone else you think we should be hearing from on SNJ In Conversation, do let us know. So for now, Hannah and Anne, Thanks very much.